Hook. The alarm hit at 11:47 p.m. Red lights strobed across the emergency wing of Falcon Point Military Hospital, and Lieutenant Grayson Voss was already shouting before the second pulse fired. "Know your rank!" His voice cut through the corridor like a blade, aimed at the woman standing at the supply terminal with a clipboard in her hand. Every head in the wing turned. Doctors, nurses, a pair of orderlies frozen mid-step, all of them watching. Evelyn Hart didn't flinch. She stood with the clipboard at her side, eyes steady, jaw set. She was 31 years old, 5'6", wearing scrubs that had seen a 12-hour shift. She looked like exactly what Voss wanted everyone to see, a nurse who had overstepped. But the number on that clipboard was wrong by $2.3 million worth of classified medical materials. And by morning, that number would start a fire nobody in that hospital was ready to contain. If this story already has you hooked, follow my channel so you don't miss what happens next. Hit like and drop a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Let's go. The thing about Falcon Point was that it didn't look like a place where things went wrong. Situated on the western edge of a sprawling Army installation in Caldwell, Nevada, the hospital occupied a low, modern complex of glass and poured concrete, surrounded by scrub brush and chain link topped with razor wire. From the air, it looked orderly, clinical, a place built for precision, the kind of facility where records were correct and accountability was assumed, and nobody cooked the books because the books were audited quarterly, and the people auditing them carried clearances that came with federal weight. That was the reputation. That was the thing Falcon Point traded on. Evelyn had worked there for 14 months. She'd taken the civilian nursing position after separating from the Army at 29. After 6 years of service that had taken her through 3 combat deployments and 2 classified attachments she wasn't supposed to discuss in job interviews. She'd discussed them anyway because the hospital recruiter had pushed, and because Evelyn had learned early that honesty was faster than performance. The recruiter had gone quiet when she described what she'd actually done overseas. Then he'd made a call. Then she'd been hired. The job itself was straightforward, surgical ward primarily. Post-op care for soldiers recovering from wounds sustained downrange. She changed dressings and managed drip lines and sat with men who woke up in the night not knowing where they were. She was good at the quiet parts. She'd always been good at the quiet parts. The supply irregularity was something she'd noticed by accident. 3 weeks before the alarm, she'd been covering a shift on the logistics side of the surgical wing, a favor to a colleague who'd gone home sick. And the inventory system had thrown an error she didn't recognize. Not a glitch, not a misky. A structural error, the kind that suggested a field had been deliberately altered. She'd flagged it with the charge nurse, who'd shrugged and said the system threw errors all the time. And then Evelyn had let it go. Except she hadn't. Not entirely. She'd written the record number down on a piece of paper and tucked it into the pocket of her scrubs. And over the following days, she'd pulled adjacent records on her own time. Lunch breaks, the quiet hour before her shift started, cross-referencing inventory entries against delivery manifests, and internal transfer logs. It was tedious work and probably not her job, and she knew that. But the numbers kept not matching, and the not matching had a pattern to it, and patterns were the thing Evelyn Hart had been trained to notice. By the 3rd week, she had a picture she didn't like. Classified medical materials, advanced wound treatment compounds, surgical biologics, a category of equipment whose procurement was restricted to military medical facilities under federal contract, were appearing in transfer records that moved them to a distribution hub on the south end of the base. The transfers were properly documented. They had signatures. They had timestamp codes. But when she traced those codes against the original procurement records, the chain of custody broke apart. Items were logged as transferred that had never been logged as received. Quantities didn't match. A shipment recorded as delivered in October showed no corresponding intake at the receiving hub. She'd brought it to Lieutenant Voss because he was the logistics officer for the surgical division and because she didn't know who else to bring it to. That had been a mistake. Voss was 44 and had the build of a man who'd once been physically intimidating and had softened into something that read more like authority than strength. He wore his rank the way some men wore cologne. You knew it was there before he entered the room. He had a way of looking at civilian staff that made the distinction clear without requiring him to articulate it, and he'd looked at Evelyn that way from the first week she'd arrived. She'd gone to his office with the printed records and her notes, and she'd laid it out carefully, the way she'd been taught to brief. Facts first, supporting data second, assessment last. He'd listened with his arms crossed and his expression blank, and when she finished, he'd said, "Are you telling me how to run logistics?" She'd said she wasn't. She was flagging an anomaly. He'd said, these records look fine to me." She'd pointed at the custody break in the October shipment. He'd said, "Systems throw errors. You said yourself you were covering for someone else. Stick to what you know, Nurse Hart." She'd left the office without the records because he'd kept them. 2 days later, the hospital ran an internal audit triggered by a quarterly compliance review. Evelyn wasn't part of it. She found out it had happened when a colleague mentioned it in passing. When she asked if the logistics anomalies had been flagged, her colleague looked at her blankly. Nobody seemed to know what she was talking about. She'd started keeping her own copies after that. The night of the alarm, she'd been on shift when a red flag notification appeared in the hospital's internal system. A security alert tied to a supply category she recognized, classified medical materials. She'd gone to the logistics terminal to check the current inventory against her notes, and that was when Voss had found her. He didn't ask what she was doing. He started talking the moment he saw her at the terminal. Step away from that system. She'd turned. The corridor was full. Shift change. Never a quiet time. 2 staff physicians were coming out of a procedure room. An orderly was pushing a cart. 3 other nurses were at the station 20 feet away. "Lieutenant Voss," she said, keeping her voice even, "there's a discrepancy in the classified materials inventory. I've been tracking. You've been accessing systems outside your authorization." He said it loud enough that the physicians slowed. He knew they'd slowed. He was speaking for the room. "I have access to the inventory terminal during surgical ward shifts. I was covering. You were not on surgical ward tonight." He stepped closer. Not threatening, just making his size present. "You accessed a logistics terminal outside your rotation without authorization. That is a security violation." The alert triggered. "I was checking. Know your rank." He said it quietly the second time, but it landed in a sudden silence that made it carry the whole length of the corridor. "You are a nurse, not an investigator, not an auditor. A nurse. Act like it." She looked at him for a moment. Then she looked at the 2 physicians who had stopped walking, and at the nurses at the station, and at the orderly who had paused with his hand on the cart. She said, "There are materials missing from this hospital's supply chain. I have documentation." "You have nothing," Voss said. "You have unauthorized system access and a pattern of interfering with administrative functions that are not your responsibility. We're done here." He walked away. 3 of the other staff followed his lead within seconds, conversations resuming, movement resuming. One of the physicians gave her a look, not unsympathetic, but also not willing to get involved, and then disappeared back through the procedure room doors. Evelyn stood at the terminal for another 30 seconds. Then she logged out and went back to her ward. She knew what was coming. It came at 6 the next morning when her shift supervisor called her into a conference room and told her that a formal complaint had been filed against her for unauthorized system access. Her keycard had been flagged for review. Pending the outcome of an internal investigation, her access to non-ward systems was suspended. She asked who had filed the complaint. Her supervisor wouldn't say. She asked if the materials discrepancy she'd flagged had been reviewed. Her supervisor said she wasn't aware of any discrepancy flag. Evelyn sat with that for a moment. Then she said, "I've been documenting this for 3 weeks. I have printed records. I'd like to submit them to whoever is conducting the internal investigation." Evelyn, her supervisor, a woman named Marcia Dole, who was generally decent and had always treated Evelyn fairly, looked uncomfortable in a way that went past professional awkwardness. "The investigation right now is about your access violations. Whatever you've been looking into, that's separate." "It shouldn't be. I know you think that." Marcia folded her hands on the table. "But I need you to understand your position here. The complaint came through Lieutenant Voss's office. He has documentation of the access incidents going back several weeks. This is not a small thing." Evelyn looked at the table. "He took my original records. I don't know anything about that. When I brought the discrepancy to him 3 weeks ago, he kept my printed documentation. He has the only hard copies outside of what I've made since then. Marcia was quiet for a long moment. I'm sorry, she said. I genuinely am. But until this investigation is resolved, you're on administrative leave. Effective immediately. The escort happened at 8 that morning. 2 security officers, polite, professional, clearly uncomfortable, walked her through the hospital to the staff entrance. Not the main exit, the side one, where deliveries came in and where there were fewer people to see. Still, people saw. A handful of colleagues at a nursing station, a physician she knew from the surgical ward who looked away quickly, an orderly who watched with an expression she couldn't read. The walk wasn't long, maybe 3 minutes, but it had the quality of much longer things. Her badge came off at the door. Her access to the hospital network was revoked before she reached the parking lot. By the time she got to her car, her phone had a notification. Her hospital email account had been suspended. She sat in the driver's seat for a while without starting the engine. To everyone who'd seen her walked out, she looked like someone who'd done something wrong. She knew how it read. She'd done this job long enough to know that narrative gravity was real, that once a story had a shape, evidence got interpreted to fit the shape. She looked guilty. She'd been escorted from the building. She'd been accessing systems she wasn't supposed to access. The complaint had been filed before the alarm had even finished cycling. What people didn't know, what nobody at Falcon Point except Voss had any reason to suspect, was that she'd made copies of her documentation before going to his office 3 weeks ago. Those copies were in a waterproof folder in the false bottom of a gear bag she kept in her car under the passenger seat, which was where she'd kept sensitive materials since her second deployment, when she'd learned that paper had a way of disappearing when it became inconvenient for certain people. She pulled out her phone and looked at the contact list for a long time. Then she called a number she hadn't called in 2 years. It rang 4 times. Then a voice she knew said, "Hart." Not a question, not a greeting, just her name, the way military people said names, like identification, like acknowledgement. "Colonel Reyes," she said, "I have a problem." Colonel Diana Reyes had commanded the medical support element of a special operations task force during Evelyn's second and third deployments. She was 51 now and held a position in Army medical oversight that Evelyn had never fully understood the scope of, partly because Reyes didn't explain things she didn't think needed explaining. She was one of those people who listened completely and spoke precisely and never wasted either. Evelyn told her everything. She didn't editorialize. She laid out the timeline, the records, the custody breaks, the conversation with Voss, the alarm, the corridor, and the escort. She described the false bottom in the gear bag. She said she had copies of everything she'd printed, along with her own handwritten notes going back 22 days. When she finished, Reyes was quiet for 4 seconds. "Don't go home," she said. "What?" "Don't go home. Not yet." "Is your vehicle clean?" Evelyn understood what she was asking. "Yes." "Drive to the extended stay on Route 9. Pay cash. Use the name we used in Kandahar." "That's... Colonel, I'm not..." "Evelyn." Reyes's voice didn't change. "You flagged a discrepancy in classified materials at a military medical facility. You were removed from the building within hours. The person who removed you controls the logistics chain you were investigating. Think about what I'm saying." Evelyn thought about it. "Okay," she said. "I'm making a call. Keep your phone on." The call ended. She sat for another moment. Then she started the car and drove to Route 9. The extended stay was the kind of motel that existed at the edge of military towns because of economic practicality rather than ambition. It was clean in the functional sense, sheets white, surfaces wiped, and anonymous in a way that had its own utility. She paid in cash, gave a name from a different chapter of her life, and was in a room on the second floor by 10 in the morning. She unpacked the gear bag, spread the documentation on the bed. 3 weeks of supply chain records, cross-referenced by hand, annotated in a handwriting that got smaller and tighter as the pattern had become clearer. She'd worked as a combat medic in environments where supplies were the difference between a soldier living and dying, and she knew what a healthy supply chain looked like, the way a musician knows what a chord is supposed to sound like. She'd known something was wrong before she could articulate why. The articulation had just taken time. Her phone buzzed at noon. Unknown number. She answered. The voice on the other end identified itself as belonging to a Special Agent Lorraine Kwan of the Army Criminal Investigation Division. She said Colonel Reyes had contacted her office. She said she had questions. Evelyn answered them for 90 minutes. At one point, Kwan asked her to describe her background, not her nursing experience, but the other part. Evelyn described it. Kwan was quiet for a moment. You were attached to the 75th Support Element? 2 rotations. Third deployment was different. I can't tell you the specifics of the third. You don't have to. Another pause. Nurse Hart, I need you to understand something. What you've described is significant. If your documentation holds up, this is not a small internal matter. I know. I need you to stay where you are. Don't contact the hospital. Don't contact Lieutenant Voss. Don't contact any of your colleagues there. I wasn't planning to. I know you weren't. I'm saying it anyway. Kwan's voice was measured, professional. But there was something underneath it, a sharpened quality, the way people sound when they've moved from information gathering into something more operational. We're going to need to move quickly. The alert that triggered last night, the security flag on the classified materials, has already escalated in ways the hospital doesn't know about yet. Evelyn processed that. How far has it escalated? Further than Lieutenant Voss would want, Kwan said. I'll be in contact. She hung up. Evelyn sat on the edge of the bed with the documentation spread around her and the television off and the afternoon light coming through the gap in the curtains. She thought about the corridor last night, Voss's voice, the way the other staff had looked at her and then looked away. Know your rank. She'd heard variations of that her whole adult life. Not always in those words. Sometimes it came as a look, sometimes as an assignment, sometimes as the deliberate exclusion from a meeting that everyone else understood was important. She'd been a woman in military medicine for 6 years and a civilian nurse at a military hospital for 14 months. And she understood the taxonomy of dismissal, the different weights of different slights, which ones were careless and which ones were calculated. That one last night had been calculated. Voss had known who was in that corridor. He'd chosen his words for the audience. What he hadn't counted on was that she'd been building a case since before she walked into his office the first time. She picked up one of the printed records and read through it again. The October shipment, the custody break, the signature code that resolved to a technician who'd been on leave when the transfer was logged. Someone had signed for a shipment using a borrowed credential. She'd circled it in red ink 3 weeks ago. She looked at the circle now and felt the particular cold clarity that came before things got complicated. Her phone buzzed again. This time it was a number she recognized. A former colleague from her combat medic days, a man named Bautista, who now worked in Federal Logistics Oversight. He texted 2 words, heard something. She called him back. What did you hear? She said when he answered. That there's a CID team being activated out of Falcon Point, that it's connected to a classified materials flag. He paused. And that a civilian nurse got walked out of the building this morning. Where'd you hear that? I have friends. He paused again, longer this time. Evelyn, the materials category in that flag. I know what classification level we're talking about. This isn't standard surgical supply. This is specialized trauma biologics, the kind of stuff that has serious black market value in certain overseas markets. She'd known that. She'd known it when she'd first identified the category 3 weeks ago. And she'd sat with the knowledge because it had implications she wasn't ready to run at until the documentation was solid. How serious, she said. Military-grade wound treatment compounds in the wrong hands can be used for a lot of things. Keeping combatants operational longer than they should be. Treating injuries that would otherwise require medical infrastructure. There are networks that pay serious money for that kind of material. He let that land. Whoever is moving this stuff, if your instincts are right, they're not running a side hustle. This is organized. I know. Are you safe? I think so. Think isn't the same as know. I know, she said again differently. After she hung up, she stood at the window and looked at the parking lot for a long time. The sun was moving into late afternoon. A family was loading luggage into a van 3 spaces down from her car. Normal world, continuing its normal operations outside the frame of what she was standing in the middle of. She'd seen this before, not this specifically, but the shape of it. The moment when a problem reveals its actual dimensions, when what looked like a paperwork error becomes something that has weight and consequence, and people who would prefer it stay buried. In Kandahar, during her third deployment, she'd been the one who noticed that a supply manifest didn't match the contents of a shipment that came in on a Tuesday. She'd flagged it to a senior officer. That officer had taken the information up the chain, and 12 days later, 3 people were arrested and a trafficking conduit was severed. She'd been thanked quietly, privately, in a way that didn't get recorded anywhere because the operation was classified. She'd learned from that experience that the people who noticed things were rarely the people who got credit for noticing. She'd also learned that noticing was the only part she had control over. The documentation on the bed represented 3 weeks of noticing. The question now was whether it was enough. Her phone buzzed. Kwan again. "We're moving tonight," she said. "There are things happening at the facility that require immediate action. I need your documentation." "I have it. I'm sending a car." Evelyn looked at the papers spread across the motel bedspread. The circled entry in the October manifest. The columns of numbers that didn't resolve into anything innocent, no matter how many times she checked them. The signature code that belonged to a ghost. "Okay," she said. "One more thing." Kwan's voice had gone very quiet. "The security alert last night? The flag that triggered it wasn't from the inventory system." Evelyn frowned. "What do you mean?" "I mean, someone filed it manually, from outside the facility's internal network." A beat. "The timestamp is 40 minutes before Voss found you at that terminal." Evelyn went still. "We've been tracking this longer than you know," Kwan said. "You weren't the only one watching, but you were the one who built the case from inside. And tonight, that matters." The car arrived 40 minutes later, a dark sedan, government plates, a driver who said nothing beyond confirming her name. She gathered the documents, put them back in the folder, put the folder under her arm. Then she walked out into the evening air and across the parking lot and into the back seat of the car. The driver pulled out of the lot and turned north toward Falcon Point. And Lieutenant Grayson Voss, who had walked away from her in that corridor so certain that rank was the final word on anything, had no idea she was coming back. The sedan moved through the dark at a steady 60, headlights cutting across 2 lanes of empty highway with nothing on either side but scrub and distance. Evelyn sat in the back with the folder across her knees and her hands flat on top of it and watched the lights of Caldwell shrink in the rear window until they were just a smear of orange against the black. She didn't try to make conversation with the driver. He'd given her his name, Torres, and his rank, which was Sergeant First Class and nothing else, which was fine. She'd spent enough time in vehicles moving toward uncertain situations that silence had its own texture. This one was professional, purposeful, the kind of quiet that meant everyone knew their job. Her own job right now was to not second-guess the folder in her hands. She'd built that documentation in stolen increments, lunch breaks, pre-shift hours, the occasional overnight when the ward was quiet and she could pull records without anyone asking why. She'd been methodical about it, the way her training had made her methodical, because in the environments where she'd learned to work, sloppy documentation got people killed. She knew the records were solid. She'd checked them enough times that the numbers lived in her head now, independent of the paper. The question she couldn't answer was whether solid was enough. Torres took an exit she didn't recognize, and the sedan turned down a 2-lane road that ran parallel to the base perimeter. Not the main gate. She noted that without commenting on it. "Where are we going?" she said. "Secondary access point," Torres said. "CID has an operations room set up inside the facility, not hospital side." "How long has that been there?" He glanced at her in the rearview mirror. "Longer than tonight." She sat with that. Kwan had said they'd been watching longer than she knew. She tried not to feel stung by that, tried to approach it practically, the way she'd approach any piece of information she hadn't anticipated. It meant the investigation had roots she wasn't aware of. It meant her documentation wasn't the beginning of the picture, just a piece of it. It also meant Voss had been operating under surveillance he didn't know about, which should have been reassuring, and mostly was. The secondary gate was manned by 2 MPs who checked Torres's credentials without ceremony and waved them through. The road inside the perimeter was unlit, and they drove it slowly, past warehouses and motor pool lots and the low silhouettes of administrative buildings, until Torres pulled up in front of a structure that looked like a maintenance office. Unmarked, Single story. A light on in one window. This is it, he said. Inside the operations room was 3 connected spaces that had been converted from storage. Folding tables covered with laptops and printed maps and evidence bags, a whiteboard with columns of case numbers, 4 people who looked up when she walked in without any of the surprise she might have expected. They'd known she was coming. Everything here had the quality of a machine that had already been running. Special Agent Lorraine Kwan was shorter than Evelyn had imagined from the voice, maybe 5'3", dark-haired, wearing a jacket over a field shirt, with reading glasses pushed up on her forehead, and the kind of stillness that read as controlled exhaustion. She crossed the room and shook Evelyn's hand with a grip that was firm and brief. "You have the documentation," she said. "Everything I pulled. Annotated." Evelyn set the folder on the nearest table. The key entry is the October manifest, signature code resolving to a technician on leave. But there are 11 other instances across a 7-week window where the custody chain breaks in the same pattern. Kwan opened the folder. She didn't page through it slowly. She went straight to the October manifest the way someone goes to a chapter they've already been told to read. "We have 3 of these independently sourced," she said. "Yours gives us 4 more. What are the other 3 from?" "A warrant officer in base logistics who noticed something in August and documented it before he was transferred." Kwan flipped to the next page without looking up. "And 2 from a federal customs flag that got triggered when materials matching this category showed up in a shipping container in Reno, 6 weeks ago." Evelyn looked at her. "Reno." "Yeah." Kwan set the folder down and looked back. "This isn't staying on base, Nurse Hart. It hasn't been staying on base for a while." The room was quiet enough that she could hear the ventilation unit in the corner. One of the other agents, young, male, wire-rimmed glasses, was typing steadily without looking up. Another was on a phone call, speaking quietly with her back to the room. "Tell me about the signature code," Kwan said. "The technician. You identified the code before you pulled his leave record?" "Yes, the code was in the transfer log. I ran it against the personnel roster separately, which is what told me he was on approved leave during the transfer window. 14 days. He was visiting family in Oregon. He's been interviewed. He has no knowledge of the transfers." Kwan said it flatly, not as new information, just as confirmation. "Someone used his credential without his awareness. We're working on how they got it." "Internal access," Evelyn said. "The logistics terminal network has shared credentials for supervisory-level users. If Voss had access to that network, which he would at his rank—" "He did," Kwan said. "He does." She paused. "Had, depending on how tonight goes." That was the first time Kwan had referenced tonight specifically, and Evelyn felt the room shift slightly around that word. "What's happening tonight?" she said. Kwan looked at her for a moment. Then she pulled a chair away from the nearest table and sat down in a way that was less invitation and more demonstration. "This is where we are. Come be here too." Evelyn sat. 4 hours ago, Kwan said, a vehicle attempted to leave the installation through a maintenance exit on the south end of the base. MP at the gate flagged the load manifest as irregular. The vehicle is currently being held at that gate. The driver is one of 3 contract workers employed through a logistics firm that Falcon Point has used for 18 months. She looked at Evelyn steadily. "The logistics firm is the same entity that processed the delivery that didn't match your October manifest." "What's in the vehicle?" "We don't know yet. We're waiting on a warrant for the full inspection, which is coming through in approximately 40 minutes. What we do know is that the vehicle was dispatched from a distribution hub on the south end of the base. The same hub where your chain of custody breaks were pointed." Evelyn was quiet for a moment. "The timing?" "Yes." "The security alert last night. The alarm. If Voss triggered it manually, we think he was moving materials before the quarterly compliance review could catch anything. The alert would have been a cover, give the appearance of security response while the actual extraction happened under it." Kwan leaned forward with her elbows on her knees. "You walking into that terminal at the wrong moment disrupted the optics. He needed you removed before you could formalize the discrepancy into official documentation. He already had my first set of records. He thought he had all of them." Evelyn didn't say anything. Kwan looked at the folder on the table. "How long have you been making copies?" Kwan asked. Since the day after I took the first set to his office. Something moved through Kwan's expression. Not quite admiration, more like the recognition of a habit she understood. Good. The young agent with the glasses looked up from his laptop. Warrants moving faster than expected. Judge is available. ETA on authorization is 20 minutes, maybe less. Kwan stood. Okay. She looked at Evelyn. I need you to walk me through the October manifest in detail. Not summary. Detail. Every field you cross-referenced and how. They worked through it for 18 minutes, standing side by side at the table, Evelyn pointing and Kwan listening, and occasionally asking questions that were short and specific and revealed how much she already understood about the supply chain architecture. The other agents moved around them, steady and purposeful. Torres came in at some point with coffee that nobody asked for and everyone took. At 9:43 Chopi, as the agent on the phone said, "Warrants through." The room changed cadence. Kwan straightened and looked at the whiteboard with its columns of case numbers. Then she looked at Evelyn. "You're going to stay here." It wasn't a question. Evelyn didn't make it one. "Understood." "I'm leaving Specialist Dang with you." She nodded at the young agent with the glasses. "If anything in that documentation needs clarification while we're at the South Gate, he'll relay to me." "Okay." Kwan picked up a radio from the table and moved toward the door. She paused at the threshold. "You built a clean case, Nurse Hart. That matters." Then she walked out, and the room got quieter, and the ventilation unit filled the silence. Dang looked at her from behind his laptop. "You want more coffee?" "No," she said. Then, "Yes, actually." He got up and poured it without ceremony, and she was grateful for that. The wait was the hard part. She'd known it would be. She'd spent enough time in operational environments to understand that the hardest position wasn't the one with the most risk. It was the one with the least information and the most time to fill. The agents at the South Gate were doing the thing. She was sitting in a converted storage room drinking bad coffee and looking at documentation she'd already memorized. Dang was a decent enough presence. He didn't try to reassure her or make small talk. He worked steadily and occasionally read something out to her that he thought she should know. "The logistics firm," he said at one point, not looking up from his screen. "Hartwell Integrated Services. You recognize that name?" "I've seen it on Manifest." They've been under a peripheral flag from a federal customs investigation for about 4 months. Different product category, different facility, but same pattern. Chain of custody breaks at the distribution point, legitimate credentials used at irregular times. He paused. "They're not a front company. They have real contracts, real employees, real operations. But somewhere in the middle of all of that, someone built a channel. Inside the company or adjacent to it? Both, probably. That's usually how it works. The company is real. The channel is hidden inside the real thing, harder to spot." He looked up briefly. "You spotted something adjacent. That's not nothing." She drank her coffee. "Who else knew about Hartwell before tonight?" The customs flag was compartmented. Voss wouldn't have known about it. He hesitated, then added, "Which means he's been operating under the assumption that the only risk was internal. Someone noticing the hospital-side discrepancies. Like a civilian nurse who had too much time on her hands during a borrowed shift." Dang looked at her. "Something like that." Her phone buzzed. She looked at it. A text from Bautista, just checking in, no information. She sent back a single word, "Okay," and put the phone face down. The next hour moved in chunks. Dang updated her in intervals when information came through his channels. The vehicle at the South Gate had been opened. The load manifest had listed medical equipment for routine disposal. Expired materials, standard decommission protocol, which was a category that got less scrutiny than inbound procurement. Inside the vehicle, under the decommissioned materials, were containers that matched the classified category from the inventory flag. Still sealed. Still tagged with the original procurement codes. She recognized one of the tag codes from the October manifest. "That's from the shipment," she said. "The one logged is transferred in October. If those tags are original, then those materials never actually moved through the transfer process at all," Dang said. "They stayed in the system on paper and in the building physically. Someone was holding them." "For how long?" "Working backward from the October log date. Minimum 9 months. She sat with that. 9 months of a ghost inventory. Materials that existed in the system as transferred and in reality as stockpiled, waiting for the right moment to move them out, and the right cover to move them under. She thought about the alarm last night, the compliance review that had been coming, the window closing. Voss had been patient for 9 months, and then the clock had run out and he'd gotten sloppy or desperate or both. He'd needed someone to be the problem, and she'd been standing at the right terminal at the wrong time. Or the right time, depending on which side of it you were on. At 11:15 p.m., Quan's voice came through Dang's radio, and even through the compression and the static it carried a quality Evelyn recognized, the particular flatness of someone delivering controlled information in a situation that was not yet controlled. "We have an issue," Quan said. Dang straightened. "Go ahead." "The driver is talking. He gave us a name for his contact inside the facility. It's not Voss." The room went very still. "Say again," Dang said. "The driver's internal contact is not Lieutenant Voss." A beat. "He's giving us a captain, medical administration, name of Stafford." Evelyn looked at Dang. He was already typing. "Voss is real," Quan continued. "Voss is involved. The credential theft, the records manipulation, that's him. But he's not the top of this. He's the logistics piece. Stafford is the authorization piece." Captain Stafford. Evelyn ran the name through everything she knew about the hospital's administrative structure. Medical administration was the division that sat above logistics, that approved procurement, that signed off on vendor contracts, that had the institutional authority to make a logistics officer's manipulations look like legitimate operations rather than anomalies. If Stafford had been authorizing, he's the one who signed the Hartwell contract, she said, not to Dang specifically, but because it had landed, and she needed to say it out loud. Dang looked at his screen, typed, looked again. "Yes," he said quietly. 18 months ago, initial contract, and the renewal 6 months later. She thought about the compliance audit that had happened after she'd first flagged the discrepancy to Voss. The audit that had found nothing. The audit that nobody had seemed to know she'd raised a concern in advance of. If Stafford controlled medical administration, he controlled who knew what before a compliance audit. He would have known an audit was coming before it happened. He would have known what it was going to look at, and he had the authority to shape what it found. "Quan," Dang said into the radio. "We have a connection. Stafford signed the Hartwell contracts, both the original and the renewal." Static, then. "We know. We're running his financial records now." Another beat. "I need you to pull everything we have on his access to the compliance audit schedule. Nurse Hart." A pause. "Is Nurse Hart still with you?" "Yes," Evelyn said, leaning toward the radio. "The compliance audit. The internal one that ran after you flagged the discrepancy. Who would have had advance notice of its scope and timeline?" "Medical administration would have had the schedule. Logistics would have had advance notice of what was going to be reviewed." She thought back to the sequence of events. There was a 2-week lead time between when the audit was announced internally and when it actually ran. "I found out through my supervisor's calendar, incidentally. But anyone in administration would have known earlier. Long enough to adjust what the audit could see." "Yes." Quan's radio went quiet for 30 seconds. Then, "We're bringing both of them in. Separate locations, simultaneous. I need another unit at the hospital. Torres is already moving." A pause. "Nurse Hart. Still here." "The documentation you built. The 7-week window. Is there anything in it that specifically connects Stafford? By name, by code, by signature?" She thought about this carefully, because careful was what the question required. She went through the records in her head. Not quickly, methodically, the way she'd built them. Column by column. Signature codes and transfer codes, and the cross-referencing she'd done between procurement authorizations and logistics logs. "The October shipment," she said. "The procurement authorization that initiated that shipment chain, it carries a 2-level approval signature. Logistics level and administration level. I documented both. I pulled them because I was trying to establish the full chain of custody. The administration level signature. I have the code. I didn't resolve it to a name because I was focused on the logistics break, but it's in my documentation. Silence. Dang, Quan said. Already pulling it, Dang said. He had the folder open on the table now, going through it with the care of someone who knew exactly how fragile paper could be as evidence. Evelyn pointed. Third page from the back. The authorization matrix. Third column from the left. He found it, looked at his screen. His jaw did something subtle. MA 7741, he said. Administration code. He typed it. The room was very quiet. MA 7741 resolves to Captain Jerome Stafford, Dang said. Medical Administration, Falcon Point Military Hospital. Quan's voice came through the radio, flat and definitive. We have our chain, Hua. What happened in the next 2 hours was not clean. Evelyn would think about that later. How nothing about a real operation ever moved with the smoothness that stories wanted to assign to it. Things stalled. Questions went unanswered for stretches that felt longer than they were. A jurisdictional issue emerged between CID and a federal agency she wasn't named and took 40 minutes to resolve. The agent running the Stafford financial records kept hitting access delays. Torres's unit had to wait on a secondary authorization before they could move on the hospital's administrative building. She sat at the table in the converted storage room and waited and drank more bad coffee and tried not to run ahead of the information she actually had. Dang worked. He was good at this, she realized. At the grinding, methodical work of building a legal case from records, at cross-referencing without losing thread. He reminded her of a medic she'd served with during her second deployment, a man named Okafor, who'd had the same quality. Total concentration, no performance about it, just the work. At 1 a.m, something shifted. She knew it before anyone said anything. The radio traffic changed cadence. There were more voices, shorter exchanges, the quality of urgency that wasn't panic but was past the point of patience. What's happening? She asked. Dang held up one finger, listened, then looked at her. Voss tried to leave the base, he said. Personal vehicle, South Gate, 20 minutes ago. She felt the air in the room change. Did he get through? No, the gate flagged him on a watch list that CID put in place 4 hours ago. Dang looked at his screen. He's being detained. He tried to run. She said it almost to herself. Looks like it. Dang's voice was neutral. Either he knew we were at the South Gate or he found out his driver hadn't checked in. Either way, he knew enough to try. She thought about the timing. The driver detained at the gate. Voss trying to leave 40-some minutes later. If he'd been waiting for confirmation that the materials were clear of the base, confirmation that never came. His phone, she said. If he was waiting on communication from the driver, CID is pulling records. Dang was already typing. But if he used a burner, the driver's phone, she said. If they communicated, there'd be traffic on the driver's phone. The driver is already talking. If CID can cross-reference, they're ahead of you, Dang said. But yeah, that's the play. She stood up because sitting had stopped being something she could maintain. She walked to the far wall and stood looking at the whiteboard with its columns of case numbers that she only partially understood. She thought about Voss at the South Gate, in his personal vehicle, caught somewhere between a plan that had been running for 9 months and a moment where it had finally come apart. She'd never felt satisfaction about this kind of thing the way some people seem to. In Kandahar, after the trafficking conduit was severed, people had celebrated in a muted military way. The acknowledgement of a completed mission. She'd participated in that. She'd felt the relief of it, but she'd also felt the weight of how long it had gone on before anyone stopped it, and the number of supply chains that had fed people who should not have been fed, and the specific cost of that in terms she'd seen firsthand. This wasn't different. Whoever was buying classified military medical materials on the black market was buying them for a purpose. And the purpose was not benign, and 9 months was a long time for a channel like that to run. Her phone buzzed, a number she didn't recognize. She looked at it for a moment, then answered. Nurse Hart. The voice was male, older, unhurried in a way that came from authority rather than ease. My name is Colonel Warren Price. I'm with Army Medical Command Oversight. Colonel Reyes contacted me this evening. She hadn't heard Reyes mention Price. She hadn't heard Reyes mention anyone above her own involvement. Yes, sir. I understand you've been working with CID tonight. I've been providing documentation, yes, sir? Good. A pause. I want you to understand something, Nurse Hart. What you're involved in tonight has implications that go past Falcon Point. The materials category in question, the classified biologics, there have been 3 other federal flags in the last 8 months involving similar materials from different facilities. We've been trying to find the connection point. She went very still. Falcon Point is the connection point, she said. We believe so. The Hartwell Company has contracts at 2 of the other facilities. Same pattern, different logistics officer in each case. Another pause. What your documentation gives us is the authorization chain, the administration level link. Stafford's name appears in records from 2 other facilities in a contracting capacity. Stafford was connecting the facilities. Through Hartwell. Yes. Price's voice was measured in a way that she now recognized as the voice of someone who had been waiting for this information for a long time. Voss was his man at Falcon Point. There are likely others like Voss at the other facilities. We're working to identify them tonight, using what CID is building from your documentation. She sat down on the nearest chair. This is larger than I thought, she said. It usually is, Price said. That's not a criticism. You found what you found from where you were standing with what you had access to. That's not a small thing. He paused. I want you to know that the administrative action taken against you this morning, the suspension, the escort, that is going to be unwound, formally. I'm putting that in writing tonight. Okay, she said, because she didn't have a better response, and she was still processing the scope of what he'd said. Get some rest when you can, Price said. Tomorrow is going to be long. He paused once more. And Nurse Hart, well done. He hung up. She sat with the phone in her hand and the whiteboard in front of her, and the sound of Dang typing and the ventilation unit running its low, steady hum. 3 other facilities. The same pattern. A network that had been building across multiple sites using a contracting company as the connective tissue, with a captain in medical administration providing the authorization at each one. A supply chain for classified military medical materials, feeding something overseas that she couldn't fully see from here but didn't have to. She knew the shape of it. She'd seen where those materials ended up. The folder on the table had her handwriting on every page. 3 weeks of lunch breaks, and early mornings, and quiet overnight hours, and the particular stubbornness that came from looking at a number that didn't add up and refusing to let that go. She heard the radio crackle. Dang leaned toward it. Kwan's voice. Hart's documentation on the Stafford authorization code, we need her to walk our evidence team through the full cross-reference. Can she come to the south gate? Dang looked at her. She was already on her feet. On my way, she said. Torres appeared in the doorway before she'd finished the sentence, which meant Kwan had planned this before she'd asked. She grabbed her jacket from the back of the chair. She was halfway to the door when Dang said, Hart. She turned. He looked up from his laptop, and something moved through his expression. Not sentiment, more like acknowledgement. The kind of look that passed between people who'd been doing serious work together in a small room for several hours. The people who got those materials overseas, he said. Stafford's records are going to trace that. When they do, I know, she said. Just wanted to make sure you knew we'd get there. She nodded. Then she went out the door and into the cold Nevada night, and Torres was already moving toward the vehicle. And somewhere on the south end of the base, a driver was still talking, and 2 men who had built something criminal and patient and well hidden across 9 months in multiple facilities were sitting in separate rooms with federal agents on the other side of the table. And in the corridor of the hospital where Grayson Voss had said, "Know your rank," in front of people who were supposed to remember it, a captain named Stafford was being walked out of his office with his hands behind his back. But as the sedan pulled out onto the perimeter road and the base lights swept past the windows, Evelyn's phone buzzed with a text from a number she didn't have saved. 3 words. Check your car. She read the text twice. Check your car. Torres was already pulling away from the operations building, tires on gravel, and she looked at the message and felt something cold move through her that had nothing to do with the Nevada night. Stop, she said. Torres looked in the rear view. We're expected at the south gate. Stop the vehicle. He stopped. She got out. The air was cold and still and smelled like dust and motor oil and somewhere distant, exhaust. The operations building was 20 feet behind them, its single-lit window throwing a pale rectangle across the ground. 3 other vehicles were parked along the near wall. One of them was hers, the civilian sedan she'd driven to the extended stay that morning, that Torres had apparently had someone bring onto the base while she was inside working. She didn't move toward it immediately. She stood where she was and thought about who had this number. Bautista, Kwan, Dang, Reyes, Torres, Price. And then below those, the layer of people who might have access to CID operational communications, which was a layer she couldn't fully map from where she was standing. What's wrong? Torres had gotten out of the vehicle. He was watching her with the particular alertness of someone who'd learned to read the body language of people who'd been in situations. Someone texted me, she said. Unknown number. Told me to check my car. Torres went still. Not surprised. Calculating. Don't touch it, he said immediately. He already had his radio out. I wasn't going to, she said. She looked at her car from where she stood and tried to run through the logic of it. Her car had been in the extended stay parking lot from approximately 10 in the morning until whenever CID had moved it onto the base. That was a window of 9 or 10 hours. If someone had known she was at the motel, and if Voss had any surveillance assets she wasn't aware of, which was an assumption she should have been making from the beginning, then that window was real. But the text had come now. Not then. Whoever sent it wanted her to check the car now, with CID personnel 20 feet away, which meant it wasn't a threat. It was a tip. Torres was speaking rapidly into his radio, and a light came on in the operations building, and Dang appeared in the doorway. She was already moving toward the car, not touching it, just looking, checking the exterior, the undercarriage as much as she could see from standing height, the wheel wells. Hart, Torres started. It's not a device, she said. If someone wanted to hurt me, they'd have done it at the motel. This is someone pointing me at something. You don't know that. No, she agreed. But look at the logic. I'm on a federal installation with CID personnel. I'm already in the middle of an active operation. A device here accomplishes nothing except turning this into a murder investigation instead of a fraud case, and that is a much worse outcome for anyone trying to avoid consequences. She looked at him. Someone wants me to find something. Torres looked at the car, then at her. Then he got on his radio again and spoke in shorthand she could only partially follow, and 30 seconds later Dang was outside with a flashlight and a pair of gloves. Pop the trunk, Dang said. I don't have the key. You brought the car here. He reached into his jacket pocket and produced her key card. She clicked it. The trunk released. They stood over it together. Standard emergency kit on the left side. A reusable shopping bag. A waterproof box she'd kept there since her army days, containing her personal backup documentation. She'd emptied it already. Those documents were in the folder inside. And underneath the shopping bag, pressed flat against the trunk liner like it had been put there carefully by someone who knew exactly how much space was available, a sealed envelope. Standard manila, no markings. She and Dang looked at it. Neither of them touched it. Gloved hand, she said. He was already putting the second glove on. He picked it up, turned it over. No writing on either side. The seal was intact. The adhesive strip, not licked, the kind with a peel-back backing. Recent. We processed this properly, Dang said, which she understood meant he was going to take it inside and log it as evidence and do this right. Okay, she said, but open it first. He looked at her. Kwan needs to know what's in it before we get to the south gate, she said. If it changes anything? He opened it. Inside was a single folded sheet. Printed, not handwritten. He unfolded it with 2 gloved fingers and held it under the flashlight. She read it over his shoulder. It was a transfer manifest. Not from Falcon Point's system. The header was different, a different facility code, a different font, but the structure was the same. Procurement codes, distribution hub codes, authorization signatures, and at the bottom, in the field for final destination, an address she didn't recognize, a street address, not a facility code, somewhere in a city that wasn't in Nevada, and in the margin, handwritten in pencil, 4 words. This one didn't stop. She read that 4 times. Then she took her phone out and called Kwan directly. Kwan picked up on the second ring. I'm at the gate. Someone left a document in my car, Evelyn said. A transfer manifest. Different facility code from Falcon Point. It has a street address as the final destination. She read the address out loud. And a handwritten note. It says this one didn't stop. A silence that was 3 seconds long but felt longer. Read me the facility code, Quan said. She did. Another silence. That's Fort Carver, Quan said. That's one of the 3 other facilities Price mentioned. The transfer went through. If that document is legitimate, yes. Quan's voice had gone into that flat, controlled register again, the one that meant she was managing information and reaction simultaneously. Someone inside this investigation left that for you. Or someone outside it who wants it to go further than we're going. A beat. Same question either way. The address, Evelyn said. Is that a residential address or commercial? She heard Quan pass the address to someone. A pause. Then, commercial. Registered to a medical supply distributor. Small operation, incorporated 2 years ago. Another pause, longer. Evelyn. That company, the registration agent, is the same individual who incorporated Hartwell Integrated Services. She stood in the cold outside the operations building with the flashlight beam on the manifest in Dang's gloved hand and felt the shape of the thing become 3-dimensional for the first time. Not a logistics officer running a theft scheme inside one hospital. Not even a captain connecting multiple facilities through a contracting company. Something underneath that, older and more deliberate, with corporate architecture built 2 years before the first Falcon Point record she'd found. This was planned before Stafford arrived at Falcon Point, she said. Before he arrived at any of the facilities, Quan said. The company was already there. They built him into it. A pause. Or he built it. We don't know the direction yet. But the materials that went through Fort Carver are somewhere in a commercial building at that address, if the manifest is current. Quan's voice sharpened. I need to make calls. Get to the south gate. Bring the document in the envelope. Chain of custody maintained. The line went dead. She looked at Dang. He was already resealing the envelope with an evidence sticker from his jacket pocket. Let's go, he said. The south gate was louder than she expected. Not chaotic, but dense with activity in the way that operational scenes were dense. People moving with purpose in the compressed space between vehicles and portable lighting rigs and the gate structure itself. The detained cargo truck sat with its rear doors open and its interior lit by standing floods. The containers were laid out on a folding examination table 20 feet from the truck, their tags photographed and bagged. 2 agents she didn't recognize were working the containers with laptops, running the procurement codes in real time. Quan was on the phone when Evelyn arrived, pointing at things with her free hand and talking rapidly. She took the evidence envelope from Dang without interrupting her call, passed it to another agent, and continued talking. Evelyn stood slightly outside the activity radius and looked at the containers on the examination table. She'd tracked these materials through records for 3 weeks. Column entries, code numbers, chain of custody fields, abstractions on paper. Here they were physical. Sealed containers the size of large shoeboxes, military green, with procurement markings and classification labels. The labels were what she knew. She'd memorized the classification structure well enough that she could read a label the way she read a patient chart. Quickly, accurately, understanding what each field meant. She moved closer. One of the agents looked up. She stopped. CID authorization, she said. I'm the source witness. He looked at her for a moment. Then he stepped aside. She looked at the top container, read the procurement code, cross-referenced it in her head against the code she'd documented. October manifest. Yes. And next to it, another container with a code from the December window she'd identified, and another from January. 9 months of accumulation, 43 containers, she counted, arranged in 4 rows. She heard Quan end her call. Fort Carver, Quan said behind her. We have an agent there now, liaising with their CID office, the Fort Carver transfer records. Their logistics officer flagged something 6 weeks ago internally. It didn't go anywhere because the flag was reviewed by the facility's medical administration, who reports to the same kind of captain that Stafford is here. Yes. Quan came to stand beside her and looked at the containers. The Fort Carver materials may already be at that address. If they moved the shipment before our agent got there, they'd need somewhere to hold them, which is what that building is. Kwan's jaw was tight. We're working on a warrant for the address. That's not Falcon Point jurisdiction. That's federal. It's moving, but it takes time we may not have. How much time? If whoever left that document in your car knows about the address, it's possible other people connected to this network know we're active tonight. If they're monitoring, they'd move the materials, or destroy the records, or both. Evelyn looked at the containers in front of her and thought about what Price had said, that the materials were going overseas. Wound treatment compounds and surgical biologics, the kind of supplies that kept combatants operational. She'd seen the end result of that, downrange, in ways that were still specific and vivid in her memory. She'd treated wounds inflicted by people who shouldn't have still been capable of inflicting anything. She knew what it cost. "Who left the document in my car?" she said. "We're working on that." It was someone with access to Fort Carver's records. That means either a federal agent or someone inside that facility. She paused. Or someone inside this network who's trying to get out of it by pointing us somewhere. Kwan looked at her. "Yes. Have you considered that the timing, tonight specifically, might not be coincidental? Voss moves materials, gets stopped. Driver talks. CID activates. Someone panics and drops a document pointing us to the next node before they become the next node." Kwan was quiet for a moment. "We've considered it. The document could be accurate and still be self-serving." "Documents usually are." Kwan's mouth was flat. "It doesn't change what we do with it. Accurate is accurate." A radio on the nearest agent's belt came alive. Rapid speech, too compressed for Evelyn to fully parse. Kwan moved toward it. Evelyn followed. She caught fragments. Fort Carver. Secondary address. Vehicle. Kwan held out her hand for the radio. The agent passed it. She listened for 12 seconds, face neutral. Then she looked at Evelyn. "The Fort Carver materials moved this afternoon," she said, "before we were active. Our agent found an empty warehouse and a manifest that's 2 days old." A pause. "The vehicle used for the transfer. Plates were captured on a commercial camera near the facility. We have the plates." "Where did the vehicle go?" "We're running it." "Kwan." Evelyn held the agent's gaze. "How many containers are we talking about at Fort Carver?" A beat. "Their manifest shows 61 units, Kwan said. 61. Plus the 43 here. More than 100 containers of classified military medical materials. And the Fort Carver portion was already in motion, already in a vehicle heading somewhere with plates that could be swapped inside an hour." Evelyn looked at the containers on the examination table in front of her and felt the scale of it press down. The Falcon Point piece was secure. The Fort Carver piece was not. And somewhere in the structure between those two facts was a person who'd known enough to leave a document in her car and who hadn't done it out of civic obligation, who'd done it because they were close enough to this network to be in it, and they'd felt the walls starting to close, and they'd made a calculation. Her phone buzzed. Same unknown number. This time it wasn't a text. It was a call. She looked at Kwan. Kwan looked at the phone, made a small gesture. "Answer it." Evelyn pressed the phone to her ear. The voice was female, low, controlled, with the careful steadiness of someone managing significant fear behind it. "The vehicle is a gray panel van," the voice said. "Nevada plates, but they were swapped this afternoon. Current plates are Arizona. The last 3 digits are 447. It's heading east on Route 15 toward the Utah line." "Who is this?" Evelyn said. A pause. "Someone who made mistakes and is trying to make one less." The voice was quiet. "The driver knows where it's going. The driver is not Hartwell. He's a contractor 2 levels below Hartwell, and he doesn't know what he's carrying, only that he's supposed to deliver it to a staging address in St. George by 6 a.m. Another pause. "There are people waiting at that address. If the van gets there." "It won't," Evelyn said. Silence. "Who are you?" Evelyn said again. The line went dead. She lowered the phone. Kwan was already on her radio. Dang had his laptop out. 2 other agents were moving. The information was in the machine now, being processed and directed and converted into action faster than she could track. She stood in the floodlit south gate, with the cold coming off the desert and the containers tagged and laid out on the examination table, and 40 people around her doing the operational work she'd handed them the foundation for. She thought about the voice on the phone. Female. Careful. Someone who made mistakes and is trying to make one less. Inside the network, close enough to know the plate numbers and the route and the destination. Not close enough, apparently, to stop caring about what happened when that van arrived. Or too close. Too embedded to do anything except what she'd done. Make a call and disappear. Quan came to her. Utah Highway Patrol has been activated. We have the plate information. Route 15 is covered between the Nevada border and St. George. She looked at Evelyn steadily. We're going to get the vehicle. Okay, Evelyn said. The staging address in St. George. We're running it now. If there are people waiting, there are people waiting, Evelyn said. Quan nodded, that flat, controlled nod. Yes. She looked at the containers again. The woman who called you. We're going to need to identify her. I know. The number will trace to a burner. I know that too. Quan looked at her with something that might have been the beginning of a question, and then her radio came alive again, and the question didn't get asked. Evelyn heard 2 words through the compression and the static before Quan moved away. 2 words that rearranged everything she'd been assuming about the shape of the night. Stafford's gone. Quan was already moving before Evelyn could ask the question forming in her head. The radio traffic thickened. Overlapping voices, clipped exchanges, the sound of an operation that had just added a variable nobody wanted. Evelyn stayed where she was and listened and assembled what she could from fragments. Stafford had been in a holding room in the administrative building on the hospital side of the base. 2 CID agents assigned to him. Somewhere in the last 40 minutes. During the warrant processing, during the Southgate activity, during the window when every available resource had been pointed at the vehicle and the containers and the incoming information from Fort Carver, the holding room had become 1 agent instead of 2 because the second had been pulled to assist with the documentation request that had come through the internal system. The request had been legitimate on its face. The timing had not been coincidental. Stafford was gone. Not from the base. The perimeter was active, all gates flagged. But from the room, and from wherever he'd gone after the room, which nobody had confirmed yet. Evelyn felt the cold settle into her differently. Not panic. Something more specific. The recognition that a situation she'd thought was resolving had just opened a new edge. Quan came back to her in under 2 minutes. Her expression was controlled in the way that required effort to maintain. He didn't go through a gate, Quan said. We have confirmation on that. He's still on the installation. Then he's waiting for something. Or someone, Quan looked at the Southgate structure behind them. Or he has resources here we haven't mapped yet. Who pulled the second agent off the holding room? Documentation request came from a logistics terminal in the hospital's administrative wing. The terminal is in a shared workspace. Multiple users, no individual login required for certain access levels. Quan's jaw moved. We're pulling the footage. If he had someone still inside, we're working that. Quan looked at her directly. Right now I need you somewhere other than an open gate on the south perimeter. If Stafford has assets on this base who are aware of your involvement, I'm not going back to the operations room, Evelyn said. Quan didn't argue. She looked at Evelyn for a moment with the expression of someone recalibrating, and then said, Fine, stay with Torres. Stay visible to my team. Torres materialized beside her almost immediately, which meant Quan had signaled him before finishing the sentence. He had the particular quality of a person who'd been briefed and was already several steps ahead of the conversation. Vehicle, he said. She got in. The sedan moved along the perimeter road with Torres driving and his radio on low and the lights of the base sliding past the windows in patterns she was beginning to recognize. She looked out at them and thought about Stafford. She'd never met him. She'd seen his name in records and his authorization code in documentation, and she'd heard his name spoken by Quan and Price in tones that placed him at the center of something that had been running for 2 years. She had no face for him, no voice, no physical sense of who he was beyond what the records implied. Someone patient, organized, and accustomed to operating inside institutional structures without being seen. That last part was the thing that mattered right now. He understood how the base worked. He'd spent enough time here, and probably at other facilities, to know which access points were monitored and which were logged but not watched in real time, and which were the kind of infrastructure that nobody looked at because it had always been there and always functioned without incident. Maintenance tunnels, service corridors, the unglamorous architecture of a working military installation that nobody mapped except the people who needed to use it. He wasn't running. If he were running, he'd have gone for the gate. He was waiting. She thought about the woman on the phone, the voice that had given her the van's plate number and route and destination, and then gone silent. Someone who made mistakes and is trying to make one less. A woman inside the network, close enough to have operational details, who'd panicked when the walls started closing and had reached for the only exit that didn't require her to walk into a CID field office. She'd called Evelyn specifically, not Quan's line, not the CID tip number, a civilian nurse's personal cell phone, which meant she knew who Evelyn was, which meant she'd been watching long enough to identify the person who'd been building the documentation case from inside Falcon Point's nursing staff. "Torres?" she said. "Yeah." "The woman who called me tonight, the one who gave us the van information, she knew my number." "We know." "She was watching me, or someone inside the network was watching me, and she had access to that information." She looked at him. "How long have I been a visible element in this?" Torres was quiet for a moment. "Since you went to Voss's office 3 weeks ago," he said. "After that, you were on his radar, and by extension on Stafford's." "So they've been watching me for 3 weeks. Monitoring, there's a difference." He glanced at her in the rear view. Watching implies resources. Monitoring implies awareness. You were a variable they were tracking. And the woman who called me had access to that tracking. Likely. She sat with that. The network had known she was documenting. They'd known she was building something. Voss's response, the corridor, the complaint, the escort, had been about removing her before the documentation became official. But it hadn't been about her specifically. It had been about the variable she represented, which meant the woman who'd called her had been close enough to Stafford or Voss to know about the variable. "Who are the women in Stafford's administrative circle?" she said. Torres didn't answer immediately. She watched the side of his face in the dark and waited. "That's a question for Dang's records pull," he said finally. "You know the answer already." A beat. "There's a civilian contracts coordinator in medical administration. Name of Renata Solis. She's been with the facility 14 months. Same onboarding cohort as you, actually. She processes vendor contract documentation." Hartwell's contracts. The authorizations that Stafford signed would have been processed through a coordinator. "She knew the system from the inside," Evelyn said. "She also knew you were documenting because the documentation touched the system she managed. When you cross-referenced the authorization matrix, you were pulling from fields she had administrative access to. The system logs user queries." Torres's voice was neutral. "She would have seen your query footprint. And she was scared enough to leave a document in my car and make a phone call." "Scared enough or smart enough? Depends which direction you're looking from." He turned the sedan onto a road she hadn't been on before, parallel to the hospital complex on the east side. CID will want to talk to her. She's going to need to make a decision about how cooperative she wants to be. She already made it. Part way. There's a difference between a tip and a statement. The hospital complex appeared on her left, the main building lit against the dark, the emergency wing with its distinctive red light array that she'd last seen from inside 2 nights ago. It looked different from outside, more institutional, less human. Her phone buzzed. "Quan." "We have footage from the administrative wing," Quan said. Stafford went through a maintenance access corridor behind the administrative wing. It connects to a utility sublevel that runs under the east side of the complex. A pause. "The sublevel has a secondary exit that opens onto the east vehicle lot. We have him on camera entering the sublevel at 23:04. We don't have a camera on the secondary exit." "East vehicle lot," Evelyn said. She looked out the window. The vehicle lot was visible from where they were, a wide, flat expanse of staff parking, half full at this hour, lit by pole lamps that left gaps between them. "We have units moving to the lot now," Quan said. But it's been 22 minutes since he entered that corridor. If he had a vehicle staged, he's gone, Evelyn said. Maybe. Kwan's voice was tight. Or he's waiting for an exit that isn't a vehicle. The perimeter is active. Every gate is flagged. If he has a contact who can get him out, the van, Evelyn said suddenly. A silence. The Fort Carver van, she said. Route 15, heading east. If Stafford has a way to connect with that vehicle before it reaches St. George, she heard Kwan processing. He'd be going with the materials, last-ditch extraction. He built this network. He knows where it ends. He knows the staging address. He knows the contacts at the other end. He knows the overseas channel. If the operation at Falcon Point is done, if he knows we have Voss and the containers, the only thing that still works for him is the Fort Carver piece, the 61 units that are already in motion. He'd need to intercept the van before Utah Highway Patrol does. How far out is the van? Kwan spoke to someone else, brief and clipped. Then back to Evelyn. Last confirmed location puts it approximately 40 miles east of the Nevada border. Utah Patrol has units deployed, but the intercept isn't confirmed yet. There's a gap on a stretch of Route 15 where coverage is thin. How thin? 18 miles of rural highway with the nearest patrol unit 12 minutes out. Another pause. If Stafford left the base 20 minutes ago in a staged vehicle, Torres had already picked up the frequency of the conversation and his hand was on his radio. He could reach Route 15 before the intercept, Evelyn said, if he knows which stretch to aim for. Kwan's voice had gone very quiet, which he would. He planned the route. Kwan. I know. He planned all of it. The route, the timing, the coverage gaps. He built this over 2 years. He knows exactly where the holes are. I know, Kwan said again, and this time the 2 words carried the weight of someone who'd underestimated the depth of the architecture they were dealing with. We're rerouting patrol units now. I'm also getting a federal air asset activated. There's a helicopter unit 40 minutes out, which is too long, but it's what we have. The sedan had stopped. Torres was out of the vehicle, talking on his radio at the edge of the east parking lot, his voice low and rapid. Evelyn got out. The night air was colder here on the east side, coming off the open ground beyond the perimeter fence. She stood and looked at the parking lot and thought about Stafford moving through a maintenance corridor 22 minutes ago, methodical and unhurried, the way someone moved when they'd already thought through the contingency. She pulled up the text from the unknown number, "Check your car," and the call record underneath it, the same number. Renata Solis, almost certainly, though the phone was a burner and confirming it was Deng's problem. She thought about what Torres had said. There's a difference between a tip and a statement. She called the number. It rang 6 times. She expected voicemail or nothing. The call connected. Silence. Then, I shouldn't have answered. Stafford is mobile, Evelyn said. Oh, Papa, we think he's going for the van, Route 15. Is there anything you know about the route that we don't? A secondary meeting point? An alternate road? Anything? A long pause. Breathing. The specific quality of someone making a decision they'd been avoiding. There's a rest stop, the woman said. Mile marker 31 on Route 15 past the Nevada line. It's where they did the first handoff, before Hartwell, when it was still small. Her voice was very controlled. Jerome would know that location. He set it up. Jerome is Stafford. Yes. Is that where he'd go to intercept? If he wanted somewhere to switch vehicles and wait for the van, yes, it's off camera. The lot is big enough. It's the kind of place that looks like nothing. Evelyn looked at Torres. He was already listening. He nodded once. Thank you, Evelyn said. Don't. The woman stopped. Started again. Just get the van. Whatever happens to me, get the van. The call ended. Torres had the rest stop location in his radio before she put the phone down. She heard it move through the channels, CID operations, Utah Patrol, the federal coordination frequency. Kwan came on and acknowledged it and started redirecting assets in the compressed shorthand of someone who'd done this before and was working against time she didn't fully have. Evelyn stood at the edge of the east parking lot in the cold and watched it happen. The moment when information became movement, when a network under pressure started to give way at the joints. She thought about Stafford at mile marker 31 on Route 15. sitting in a staged vehicle in a rest stop he'd used before, waiting for a van carrying 61 containers of classified military medical materials, thinking the operation could still extract something functional from a night that had collapsed around it. He wouldn't know about the tip. He wouldn't know that the rest stop had been named. He'd built 2 years of careful architecture, and it was coming down because a contracts coordinator who'd been watching the wrong variable, watching Evelyn build documentation in the system, watching the query footprints accumulate, watching the walls move closer, had decided at the last possible moment that the direction she was standing in mattered. 40 minutes later, at mile marker 31, Utah Highway Patrol found a late model SUV with Nevada plates parked in the far corner of the rest stop lot, engine running, driver's side window down. Captain Jerome Stafford was in the driver's seat with his phone in his hand, monitoring a frequency he'd believed was secure, when 3 patrol vehicles came in from 2 directions simultaneously, and the federal coordinating agent came in on the frequency he was monitoring and said his name. He didn't run. Evelyn would learn that later, that he'd sat there for 11 seconds after the patrol vehicles lit up, and then he'd put the phone face down on the passenger seat and put his hands on the steering wheel and waited. The way someone waited when they'd understood the math and accepted the outcome. Not defeated, exactly. More like a calculation that had finally resolved. The van was stopped 20 minutes after that, 9 miles east of the rest stop on Route 15 by a Utah patrol unit that had been repositioned based on the same tip. The driver, a contractor 2 levels below Hartwell, exactly as the woman on the phone had described, surrendered without incident. He was confused in a way that read as genuine. He'd been told he was delivering medical disposal materials to a waste management facility, and he'd believed it. And when the patrol officer told him what was actually in the truck, he went very quiet and didn't say anything else until a lawyer was present. 61 containers. Every procurement code matched Fort Carver's records. Chain of custody intact on the container side, broken everywhere in the paperwork. The same pattern as Falcon Point, just further along in the extraction process. None of it had gotten out of the country. Not tonight. Quan called Evelyn at 2:47 a.m. and said, "We have him." She was sitting in the operations room again, at the same table where she'd started the night. Dang had brought more coffee. Neither of them commented on how much coffee they'd consumed or how long the night had been. "Stafford," Evelyn said, "in custody, processing now." A pause. The SUV had a go bag, passport, cash, a second phone. He was planning to stay with the van until it transferred to the overseas shipping contact, then extract with the first payment. We found the routing details on the second phone. Where was it going? The materials, ultimately. Eastern Europe. There's a medical black market there that has been running for several years. Conflict zones, non-state actors, private military contractors who need to keep personnel operational without access to legitimate medical infrastructure. Quan's voice was flat. This was the supply chain they'd been missing. Stafford found the gap and built the pipeline. She'd known this in the abstract. Hearing it stated directly had a different weight. "How many facilities?" she said. "We're confirming 4, including Falcon Point and Fort Carver. 2 others are being contacted tonight. Their logistics officers are persons of interest. We don't have confirmation of awareness yet, but the contract pattern is the same." A pause. "Hartwell is being seized. The company records are going to take months to fully process." She thought about the 2 years of corporate architecture. The incorporation of a distribution company before Stafford had arrived at any of the facilities, which meant either he'd planned the network before taking his first position, or someone else had built it and inserted him into it. That question was going to take longer than tonight to answer. "The woman who tipped us," Evelyn said. "Renata Solis." "We need to talk to her," Quan said. "She's currently not in her on-base quarters. She left sometime in the last 2 hours." A beat. "She'll surface. She's not the kind of person who disappears permanently. She has family here, ties here. She's scared right now. But she's also the one who gave us Stafford and the van, and that matters. Her cooperation is going to be the deciding factor in what her situation looks like legally." She knew it was wrong, and she stayed in it. Yes. And then she got scared enough to climb out the only way she could see. Also yes. Kwan's voice was neither judgment nor absolution. That's for prosecutors and courts to sort out. What I know is that without her, Stafford might have made the intercept and the van might have cleared Utah. What's in those 61 containers might have been on a ship by Thursday. Evelyn looked at the documentation folder on the table, the pages she'd been looking at all night, carrying across a parking lot and into a sedan and into an operations room, 3 weeks of lunch breaks and early mornings. What happens now? She said. Now. Tonight. You go somewhere and sleep, Kwan said. Tomorrow, the formal witness process starts. Your documentation is going to be central to the federal case because you built the chain that connects Stafford's authorization code to the procurement irregularities. Without that chain, the records we've seized tonight are pieces. Your documentation is the spine. A pause. Colonel Price is handling the administrative reversal on your suspension, formally, in writing, before the end of business tomorrow. Your access to Falcon Point is reinstated and the complaint against you is being withdrawn and expunged. She sat with that. The complaint. The escort. The badge coming off at the side entrance with colleagues watching from the nursing station. She didn't feel vindicated exactly. She felt tired, and the tiredness had a specific texture. Not the tiredness of too little sleep, but the tiredness of sustained concentration over a long period. The kind that lived in the shoulders and behind the eyes, and took real rest to move. Kwan, she said. Yeah. The soldier at mile marker 31, Stafford, when he was stopped. Did he say anything? A brief pause. Not to our agents? No. Okay. Why? She thought about how to answer that. She thought about Voss in the corridor saying, "Know your rank," for an audience of colleagues who'd looked away, and Stafford in an administrative office 2 floors up, authorizing contracts and shaping audit scopes, doing the larger version of the same calculation, that rank and position and institutional authority were sufficient cover for a long time, possibly forever. I was just wondering if he understood what happened, she said. He understood, Kwan said. You can always tell. Besides, Voss was processed at 4 a.m. in a holding facility on the base. Evelyn wasn't there for it, but Dang told her about it the next morning, that Voss had asked for a lawyer immediately, which was his right and the smart move, and that he'd been informed of the charges, which were numerous and serious, and that his expression through the entire process had been the expression of a man recalculating rather than collapsing, adjusting to a new set of facts without accepting responsibility for the facts. That was a familiar kind. What was less familiar was what happened at 7 that morning when Dang pulled up a secondary set of financial records that the overnight warrant had unlocked from Hartwell's corporate accounts. Accounts that had been layered through 2 intermediary entities, cleaned through a real estate holding company in Arizona, and deposited into accounts that Dang tracked with the patient attention of someone who understood how money moved when it was trying not to be seen. The accounts resolved to 3 names, Voss, Stafford, and a third name that nobody had said yet. Dang looked at it on his screen for a long moment without speaking. Then he said, Hart, come look at this. She came to the table, looked at the screen. The third name had a rank attached to it. Not captain, not lieutenant, colonel. And the colonel was not at Fort Carver or any of the other 3 facilities. The colonel was at Falcon Point. Had been at Falcon Point for 26 months. Had been there before Stafford arrived, before the Hartwell contract was signed, before the first record in Evelyn's documentation file. She read the name twice. Then she said, Does Kwan know? She's about to, Dang said, and reached for his radio. And in a senior officer's quarters on the north side of Falcon Point Military Hospital, a light was on at 7 in the morning, which meant someone was already awake, already reading what Evelyn didn't yet know they had access to. Already running the same math that Stafford had run at mile marker 31 on Route 15, the math that resolved to one answer when the walls came in from every direction. Already deciding what a person did when the calculation finally ran out. Dang's radio call brought Kwan back from the south gate in 11 minutes. Evelyn knew it was fast because she'd been watching the clock on the operations room wall without meaning to, the way you watch things when you were too tired to look away and too alert to rest. The clock said 7:14 when Kwan walked through the door, and the expression on her face said she'd been briefed in the vehicle on the way back. She went straight to Dang's laptop, looked at the screen, said nothing for about 15 seconds, Then, pull his access logs, everything, from the day he arrived. Already running, Dang said. Quan straightened and looked at the wall. Not the whiteboard, just the wall, the blank institutional surface of it. And Evelyn recognized the specific quality of that look. It was the look of someone adding a new dimension to a structure they'd been building in their head and finding that the new dimension changed the weight of everything already in it. Colonel Marcus Hale, Quan said. Not to Evelyn specifically, to the room. Evelyn knew the name, not well. She hadn't had direct dealings with him, but he was visible at the facility in the way senior officers were visible. His name on certain communications, his signature on certain protocols, his presence at administrative events she'd attended as a staff member. He was 61 years old and had been at Falcon Point for 26 months, in a senior oversight capacity that sat above medical administration and reported to base command. He was the kind of officer whose rank made him a background figure rather than an active presence, the person who approved things rather than doing them, whose name appeared in institutional architecture rather than in daily operations, which was exactly the position you would want if you were the foundational layer of a 2-year criminal network. He was here before Stafford, she said, 23 months before. Quan turned from the wall. He was here before the Hartwell Incorporation. The room went quiet enough that the ventilation unit filled it again with its low, steady hum. He didn't just enable this, Evelyn said. He built it. Stafford was his operational arm. And Voss was Stafford's operational arm. Quan's voice was controlled, but underneath it was something that read as fury held at a professional distance. 3 layers, we had 2. The financial records just gave us the 3rd. Deng was typing without pausing. His access logs are going to take an hour to fully process. But preliminary. He accessed the base's perimeter security scheduling system at 11:47 last night. Evelyn looked at him. That's when the second agent was pulled off Stafford's holding room. Yes, Deng said. The documentation request that pulled the agent, it was authorized through a system that Hale has access to. He let Stafford out, Quan said flatly. He tried to. Deng looked at his screen. But Stafford didn't make it. Hale doesn't know that yet, Evelyn said. The room shifted. Quan looked at her. He's in his quarters, Evelyn said. Light on at 7 in the morning. He's running the same math Stafford ran at mile marker 31, except he doesn't know how the math resolved yet. He doesn't know we have Stafford. He doesn't know about the financial records. Quan was already on her radio. She spoke in shorthand, units, positions, the particular vocabulary of an operation that had just expanded its perimeter. Then she looked at Evelyn and said, "Stay here." He's going to run the same calculation Stafford ran and get a different answer, Evelyn said. Stafford was trying to extract with the materials. Hale doesn't have materials to extract with. His answer is going to be, I know what his answer is going to be, Quan said. Stay here. She went out the door with Torres behind her and 2 other agents that Evelyn didn't know by name, and the operations room was suddenly just Evelyn and Dang and the sound of vehicles starting outside. She sat down. Dang kept typing. He said, without looking up, "You should probably actually sleep at some point." "I know. We have folding cots in the back." "I know that too." She didn't move. She looked at the whiteboard with its columns of case numbers and thought about Colonel Marcus Hale in senior officers' quarters on the north side of the installation, reading something off a screen, communications, surveillance, whatever window he had into what had been happening tonight, and doing the arithmetic of a man who'd spent 2 years believing his position in the architecture was sufficiently removed from the operational layer that it could never be specifically traced. He'd been wrong by one contracts coordinator who'd made one phone call. The thing about networks built on institutional authority was that they felt invincible from the inside. The rank protected you. The structure protected you. The assumption that investigators would look at the people doing things before they looked at the people authorizing things. That asymmetry was the whole bet. Voss was visible because Voss was in the supply room. Stafford was visible because Stafford signed the contracts. Hale was supposed to be invisible because Hale was 3 layers up, his name and account records behind 2 shell entities, his access to the perimeter security system just one of 50 things a senior officer could legitimately access. Except the account records were open now. and the perimeter security log was time-stamped. And a nurse who'd been escorted out of the building with her badge removed had spent 3 weeks building the kind of documentation that gave investigators a chain that held. She heard vehicles moving outside. Then, after a while, nothing. The particular nothing of an operation that had gone to a different location. She waited. At 8:22 a.m., Kwan called. "We have him," she said. Evelyn let out a breath she hadn't been aware of holding. "He didn't run?" "He tried." A pause that had something complicated in it. "He was in his vehicle in the north lot. We had 2 units already positioned based on your read of the situation. He came out of quarters at 7:58 with a bag, saw the units, and stopped. He stood there for about 30 seconds and then put the bag down." She thought about that. A senior officer with 20-some years of service standing in a parking lot at 8 in the morning with a bag at his feet, and federal agents on 3 sides, running the final version of an arithmetic that had been running for 2 years. "What did he say?" she said. "He asked to speak to his attorney." A pause. "Then he said, and I'm quoting, 'Tell whoever built the financial case that it was good work.'" She didn't respond to that. "Evelyn," Kwan said, and it was the first time she'd used the first name without rank or title. "It's done." She looked at the whiteboard, the case numbers in their columns, the names she'd heard over the course of one very long night, accumulated like evidence. "Okay," she said. The processing of Colonel Marcus Hale happened in a federal holding facility off base, which was appropriate given that a senior officer being held on base had already produced 1 escape and 1 near escape. Stafford and Voss were moved to the same facility by mid-morning. 3 individuals, Hale, Stafford, Voss, in 3 separate rooms, each with legal representation, each facing a charge sheet that had been assembled with the particular thoroughness that comes from having both financial records and physical evidence and witness cooperation and documentation built by a civilian nurse over 3 weeks of lunch breaks. Renata Solis surfaced at 10 a.m. She walked into the Caldwell Field office of the Army Criminal Investigation Division and asked to speak with Special Agent Kwan. She had a lawyer with her, a woman she'd apparently called in the pre-dawn hours and who'd advised her to come in immediately and cooperate fully. She was 34 years old and had been inside the network for 16 months and had understood what she was part of for approximately 14 of those months, which was a weight she'd been carrying in ways that had begun to show. Evelyn didn't meet her. She wasn't part of that process and didn't need to be. She learned these details from Dang, who had a practiced way of relaying information that stripped it of commentary while somehow still conveying texture. What Solis gave the investigation was the final connective layer, the internal communications, the code system used for off-record coordination between Hale, Stafford, and the Hartwell principals, the timeline of how the network had expanded from its initial single-facility operation to 4 sites. She gave them names that appeared in documents they already had, but hadn't fully resolved. She gave them a contact at the overseas receiving end, a name and a location that would become the subject of a separate federal action coordinated with international partners. She gave them everything, and everything in this context was substantial. The federal prosecutor assigned to the case called it the most complete institutional fraud disclosure she'd seen in a military medical context. She said this to Kwan, who relayed it to Dang, who mentioned it to Evelyn in the same neutral tone he used for everything. Evelyn was in the operations room when Dang said it, sitting at the same table she'd been at most of the night, eating a sandwich that Torres had produced from somewhere without explanation. It was 11 in the morning, and she'd been awake for 29 hours, and the sandwich was the most concrete thing in the room. "The prosecutor thinks it'll be comprehensive," Dang said. "Good," she said. "It's going to be a long case. Federal, multi-facility. International component. I know. Your documentation is going to be central to the initial indictment." He looked at her over his laptop. "You're going to be deposed. Multiple times, probably." "That's fine." He went back to his screen. Then, after a moment, "You should probably get some sleep before any of that." She finished the sandwich. Then she went to the back room and found one of the folding cots and lay down on it and closed her eyes and was asleep in under 4 minutes. She slept for 6 hours. When she woke up, the operations room was quieter. Fewer people, the specific low-energy quality of an operation that had transitioned from active to administrative. Dang was still there, because Dong seemed to be a permanent feature of whatever room she was in. Quan had gone to the federal facility and returned and was on a call that had been going for a while based on the patient set of her expression. Evelyn sat up. Her neck was sore from the cot angle and her eyes felt like they'd been run through something abrasive. She found water, drank it, found more. Quan finished her call, came to the back room doorway. "How are you feeling?" she asked. "Functional," Evelyn said, which was accurate if not complete. Colonel Price's office has sent the formal administrative reversal. It's in writing, time-stamped, filed with both base command and the civilian HR system. Quan leaned against the doorframe. "Your access is reinstated. The complaint is expunged. The escort is documented as having been conducted under false pretenses at the direction of Lieutenant Voss, which is now part of his charge sheet." She heard all of that. She filed it in the part of her head that was tracking practical outcomes. "What about my ward?" she said. Quan looked at her for a moment. "Your ward?" "My patients. I've been off the surgical ward for 2 days. I have post-op patients. Your supervisor has been briefed that your absence was connected to an ongoing federal investigation and that you're cleared to return." A slight pause. Ms. Dole seemed relieved isn't the right word, more like she understood more than she'd let herself show. Marcia Dole had been decent through an uncomfortable situation, and Evelyn didn't resent the discomfort she'd put her in. Institutional pressure was institutional pressure. Marcia had a family and a career, and she'd done what most people did when the pressure came down from above. She'd complied with the formal process and kept her personal feelings separate. That was human and normal, and Evelyn understood it. "I'd like to go back to the ward," she said. "Today?" "Tomorrow. Today I need—" She stopped, thought about what she needed. "I need to drive somewhere that isn't a base." Quan looked at her for a moment with something that might have been the beginning of a smile if she'd been less professionally contained. "Okay," she said. "Torres will take you to your car." She drove north out of Caldwell on a 2-lane highway that ran toward the edge of the Nevada desert before curving back toward the mountains. She had no destination. She drove for 40 minutes with the windows down and the cold air coming through and the landscape doing what Nevada landscape did, opening up into something that was too large and too indifferent to carry the weight of the previous 30 hours. She pulled over at a turnout that looked over a dry lake bed. Got out. Stood at the edge of the gravel and looked at it. She wasn't processing the way she'd expected to process. There was no neat emotional resolution to the night. No moment of clear, clean feeling that she could point at and name. What she had instead was a kind of complicated flatness, the way you felt after sustained concentration finally released its grip and left behind not relief, but just the absence of pressure, which was different. She thought about Voss in the corridor. The specific theatrical quality of know your rank delivered for an audience at a pitch calculated to carry. She'd known men like him her whole life. Not all of them were corrupt. Some of them just had a deeply held belief that rank was the end of a sentence, that authority conferred by institution was sufficient replacement for judgment, that the order of things as arranged was essentially correct, and anything that disturbed the arrangement was a problem to be managed rather than a signal to be read. Voss had been that, and also a criminal. The two things were connected, she thought. The same worldview that made him dismiss a nurse flagging an irregularity was the worldview that had led him believe he could run a 9-month theft operation and be protected by his own position. The hierarchy wasn't just cover, it was the logic that made the crime feel permissible. He was an officer. Officers didn't answer to nurses. The question a nurse raised about his supply chain was, in his framework, simply not a question worth taking seriously. He'd been wrong about that. Consequentially, permanently, in ways that would follow him for the rest of his life, wrong. She stood at the edge of the dry lake bed and breathed the cold Nevada air and tried to feel the satisfaction of that more cleanly than she did. It was there. She wasn't going to pretend it wasn't. There was something real and specific about the fact that the man who told her to know her rank was going to spend years untangling himself from federal charges that she'd initiated with a printed spreadsheet and 3 weeks of lunch breaks. That was real, But it wasn't the whole of what she felt. She thought about the materials in those containers. 43 at Falcon Point, 61 at Fort Carver. 104 units of classified military medical biologics that had been accumulating in a shadow inventory across 9 months pointed at an overseas market that bought them because somewhere people were in conflict and needed their wounded operational and couldn't access legitimate medical infrastructure to accomplish that. She'd treated wounds downrange. She knew the cost of fighting people who should have been too injured to fight. She knew it in her hands, in the specific muscle memory of procedures she'd performed in conditions that had no business being surgical. None of those containers had made it to a ship. That was the actual weight of the night. Not the arrests, though those mattered. Not the financial records or the warrant or the way Stafford had put his hands on the steering wheel at mile marker 31. The weight was the materials that hadn't moved, and the chain of harm that hadn't extended, and the specific people downrange who would never know that a nurse at a military hospital in Nevada had spent 3 weeks cross-referencing supply chain records in her lunch hour because a number hadn't added up. That was the thing she carried back from the turnout. Not vindication, though she had that. Not the satisfaction of being right, though she'd been right. Something smaller and more solid. The sense that the work had mattered in a direction that went past her own story and landed somewhere she'd never be able to see. She got back in her car. She drove back to Caldwell. She checked into a real hotel this time. Not the extended stay, a different one, with a real bed and a door that locked, and hot water that ran without interruption. She slept for 9 hours. She woke up and called Bautista and told him enough that he'd stop worrying, which took about 4 minutes because he was perceptive and efficient about concern the way he was perceptive and efficient about everything. She called her sister in Arizona, who had texted twice during the previous 48 hours with increasing urgency, and who took 10 minutes longer to reassure because her sister's concern was less efficient and more voluble, and Evelyn appreciated that about her even when it was exhausting. Then she drove back to Falcon Point and went to work. Marcia Dole met her at the entrance to the surgical ward with an expression that cycled through several things before settling on something practical. "You look terrible," Marcia said. "I know. You should take another day. I've been awake and horizontal for 9 hours. I'm fine." She looked at Marcia steadily. "How's the ward?" "Your post-ops are stable. Corporal Medina had a complicated night Tuesday. Wound site, not serious. Resolved with standard intervention." A pause. "He's been asking where you are." "I'll see him first." Marcia looked at her for a moment with something that came up around the edges of the professional container she kept things in. "Evelyn, I owe you an apology." "You don't." "I do. I knew something was wrong when I escorted you out. I didn't have the specifics, but I knew—" "Marcia," she kept her voice level, "you did what the process required in the information environment you were in. I understand that. I'm not carrying anything about it." She meant it. Some of it, anyway. Enough of it that the parts she was still working through weren't Marcia's to carry. "Let me get to Medina." Marcia stepped aside. The surgical ward was the same. That was the thing that struck her, walking back through it, how entirely itself it still was. The specific sounds, the steady percussion of monitors, the soft-soled footfall of nursing staff, the particular quality of a ward that ran on controlled routine because controlled routine was what kept people alive. She'd been gone 2.5 days, and the ward had not noticed her absence in any structural sense, which was how it should be and which she found oddly reassuring. Corporal Medina was 23 and had been at Falcon Point for 6 days recovering from a leg wound that was healing well enough to be boring, which meant he'd had energy to be anxious about everything else. He was sitting up in bed when she came in, and the look on his face when he saw her was so uncomplicated in its relief that she had to breathe through something before she spoke. "You're back," he said. "I'm back." She checked his chart, checked the wound site, asked him the question she always asked. He answered them and then said, "Were you in some kind of trouble?" "I was involved in something complicated," she said. "It's resolved." "Are you okay?" She looked at the chart, made a notation. "Yes," she said, and found that she mostly meant it. She worked the rest of that shift and the shift after it. She changed dressings and monitored drips and had a difficult conversation with a soldier named Ruiz who was struggling with the reality of what his injury was going to mean for his service, and who needed someone to sit with that with him rather than minimize it or redirect it. She sat with it. She didn't have solutions, and she didn't pretend to have solutions, but she had time and steadiness and the particular utility of someone who'd been in a version of that conversation before and knew how to hold it without flinching. The ward didn't know the specifics of what had happened. Some of the staff had seen her escorted out 2 days before, the ones who'd been at the nursing station, who'd looked at her or away from her in the particular way of people encountering something they don't know how to place. Some of them came to her with the specific awkwardness of people who understood more than they'd been told and weren't sure how to acknowledge it. She didn't make it easier or harder, she just went back to work. The formal charges were filed 10 days after the night at the South Gate. Evelyn read the summary that Quan sent her in a message that was factual and thorough and took about 4 minutes to get through. Lieutenant Grayson Voss, theft of government property, conspiracy to defraud the United States, misuse of government systems, falsification of federal records, obstruction of an official investigation. Captain Jerome Stafford, the same charges plus conspiracy to traffic classified military materials, wire fraud, money laundering across 3 jurisdictions. Colonel Marcus Hale. Everything Stafford faced, plus a charge specific to his rank and position, abuse of a position of trust in a national security capacity, which carried its own weight in the federal system. 3 men, 3 separate charge sheets. The combined volume of the documentary evidence supporting those sheets ran to several thousand pages, anchored by financial records and the physical evidence from the South Gate and Fort Carver, and structured by a foundation of cross-reference supply chain documentation that had been built by a civilian nurse who had been dismissed from the building 2 days before the arrests. Renata Solis entered into a cooperation agreement. Her charges were reduced in exchange for her complete testimony, which was substantial and which the federal prosecutor characterized as essential to establishing the full timeline and the communication architecture of the network. Her cooperation agreement required community service and restitution and prohibited her from federal contracting work permanently. It was not lenient. It was also not prison, which was what full prosecution would have meant, and she'd made her calculation. Evelyn didn't feel strongly about that in either direction. Solis had done damage, and she'd also done the thing that ended the network's ability to run. Both of those were true. Holding them both without forcing them into a hierarchy felt more honest than deciding which one canceled the other. The 4 facilities were audited simultaneously, under federal oversight, with findings shared across the investigative team. 2 additional logistics officers were identified as participants, 1 at each of the remaining facilities. Neither had Voss's level of direct involvement, but both had knowingly participated in the chain of custody manipulation. Their cases were referred to the relevant CID offices. Hartwell Integrated Services was dissolved and its assets seized. The corporate records, when fully processed, revealed a financial architecture that had moved approximately $2 million across the 2-year operational period, money that had gone to Hale, Stafford, Voss, and a set of overseas principals whose cases were referred to international partners for prosecution under their own jurisdictions. The overseas principals were not Evelyn's to follow. That thread went into channels she wasn't part of and would probably never fully know the outcome of. She made her peace with that. The piece she could follow, she followed. The recognition ceremony happened on a Tuesday in November, 8 weeks after the arrests. Evelyn had been told about it in advance and had asked twice whether it was necessary and had been told twice, with increasing firmness from Colonel Price's office, that it was. She'd asked whether it had to be in the hospital and been told that given the nature of what had occurred, the hospital was specifically where it needed to happen. She'd accepted that. She wore her civilian dress uniform, the phrase she used privately for the dark blazer she kept for formal occasions. She parked in the staff lot she'd always parked in, walked through the entrance she'd always used, badged in with the access that had been reinstated in writing 6 weeks earlier. The corridor outside the surgical wing was the same corridor. The same overhead lighting, the same institutional floors, the same nursing station where colleagues had been standing when Voss had delivered his line for an audience. Someone had put a small arrangement of flowers on the station counter, which was slightly against regulations and which nobody seemed to be addressing. Approximately 60 people were assembled in the corridor and the adjacent conference room. Clinical staff, administrative staff, base command representatives, Quan and Dang and Torres in civilian clothes that somehow made them look more official rather than less. Marcia Dole was there, standing with two other charge nurses, her expression composed in the particular way of someone who'd processed their own complicated feelings about a situation and arrived somewhere they could stand in. Colonel Price was there in person, which she hadn't expected because she'd assumed he'd send a representative. He was a tall man with gray at his temples and the careful posture of someone who'd spent decades in uniform and now carried it in civilian clothes without appearing to think about it. He shook her hand before the formal portion began and said, "I'm sorry it took this long to get here." She said, "It got here." He looked at her for a moment. "Yes, it did." The formal portion was brief. She was glad of that. Price spoke about institutional integrity and the obligation of people inside systems to raise alarms when systems failed, and he said it with enough specificity that it wasn't the kind of speech that could have been given for anyone else in any other situation, which was the most she could have asked for. He presented the Distinguished Civilian Service Award, the same one, he said, that would be entered into the permanent record of Falcon Point Military Hospital as a corrective annotation to the administrative action taken against her 2 months prior. She received it, said thank you, said a few other things that she'd thought about in advance and that came out the way she'd intended, which wasn't always how speeches worked for her. She said that the work that mattered in a situation like this was the slow, unglamorous work, the cross-referencing, the printed records, the decision to make a copy before you needed one. She said that the people who noticed things and said so in environments designed to discourage noticing were doing something that required more than courage. They were doing something that required patience and precision and the willingness to keep building a case when everyone around you was telling you there was no case to build. She looked out at the 60 people in front of her and said that rank had its place, that structure had its place, that the people who'd built this hospital and staffed it and dedicated their careers to it were, most of them, doing exactly what they were supposed to do, but that structures were not self-correcting, that institutions didn't fix themselves, that the thing which had been discovered and dismantled in the previous 2 months had existed precisely because it had been built inside the assumption that rank was the last word, that the layers above would protect the layers below, and the authority at the top would make the questions from the bottom irrelevant. She said, "I was told to know my rank, and I do. I know exactly what it is and what it can do." She paused. Turns out it was enough. Applause. She didn't love applause, but she understood its function, and she let it happen. Afterward, people came to her in the way people came to people at events like this, some with genuine things to say, and some with the social obligation of presence. She accepted both. A corporal she didn't know shook her hand and said his brother had been a patient at one of the other facilities, and he'd heard what the stolen materials were for, and he wanted her to know he understood the stakes. She looked at him and said she did too. He nodded. They didn't say anything else and didn't need to. Dang found her near the end of the gathering. He was holding a cup of coffee that was probably as bad as the coffee in the operations room and drinking it with the same equanimity. "Federal trial date for Hale is set for March," he said. "Voss and Stafford are expected to plead before then. Their lawyers are negotiating." "What are they negotiating for?" "Reduce sentences in exchange for testimony that further establishes Hale's role in the network's founding." He sipped the coffee. "They'll probably get something, not nothing." She thought about Voss entering a plea, the specific geometry of that. A man who'd stood in a corridor and performed contempt for an audience, reduced months later to negotiating the terms of his own accountability. She didn't feel triumph about it. She felt the finality of it, which was a different and quieter thing. "The overseas contact," she said, "the one Solis gave you. Still active. International coordination is slow." Dang's tone was matter-of-fact. "It'll happen. These things take time." "I know." Quan appeared at her shoulder. She had a glass of water and the contained expression she'd been wearing all evening, and Evelyn had begun to understand that expression as Quan's version of relaxed. "You're going back to the ward tomorrow?" Quan asked. "Yes." "Good." A pause. "The deposition schedule is going to start in 2 weeks. You'll get notifications from the prosecutor's office." I know. I'm ready for it. Quan nodded. She looked around the corridor, the gathering in the process of dispersing, the fluorescent overhead light, the nursing station with its illegal flowers, and something moved through her expression that was brief and that Evelyn catalogued without comment. You did something unusual, Quan said. I want to make sure you know that, not the technical piece, though the documentation was clean and it held up and that mattered. The unusual part was that you kept building after he took your records. Most people recalibrate. They factor in the cost and decide it's not their problem. It was my hospital, Evelyn said. I know, that's the unusual part. Quan looked at her. The people who noticed things in the other 3 facilities, they noticed. They mentioned it. Then they stopped when it didn't go anywhere. You're the one who didn't stop. She didn't respond to that. She thought about what it would have felt like to stop, to file the numbers away, to tell herself it was above her pay grade and below her job description and not her responsibility, and probably nothing anyway. She thought about how easy that would have been. How many people in how many institutions had made that exact calculation and been both completely understandable and completely consequential? She hadn't stopped. She didn't know entirely how to explain that except to say that the number had been wrong and the wrongness had a pattern, and patterns, in her experience, were not self-resolving. Someone had to stay with them until they resolved. She'd been available for that. So she'd done it. The gathering finished. People drifted toward exits, conversations trailing off in the way of things that had concluded. The corridor resumed the quality of itself. A working hospital, mid-evening, the sounds of a ward in motion behind the doors at the far end. Evelyn stood in the corridor alone for a while after the others had gone, held the award in both hands, looked at the space where 60 people had been standing and was now empty again and fluorescent lit and entirely ordinary. She thought about what had happened here. In this specific corridor, 2 months ago, a man had used the architecture of authority to try to make her small. He'd needed an audience for it, which told her something she already knew. Contempt without witnesses was just an opinion. It needed people watching to become something you were supposed to feel. She'd felt it. She wasn't going to pretend she hadn't. Being walked out of a building with your badge in someone else's hand, with colleagues watching who didn't know which version of the story to believe, that had a weight, and the weight had been real, and carrying it had cost something she was still, slowly, getting back. But here was what she'd learned, not for the first time, and probably not for the last. The people who reached for rank as their final argument usually did so because it was the only argument they had left. Real authority didn't need to announce itself in corridors. Real authority was what you built over years of doing the thing correctly, in the small and unglamorous ways, in the rooms where nobody was watching. She'd been doing that since Kandahar, since before Kandahar, since the first time she'd been the youngest person in a room and the only woman, and had looked at a problem that everyone else was looking past, and had decided that not seeing it wasn't an option. She put the award under her arm and walked down the corridor toward the surgical ward. Behind her, the corridor was empty. Ahead of her, a ward full of people who needed what she knew how to give. Tomorrow there would be depositions to prepare for, and a federal case to support, and a supply chain audit still working through the 4 facilities. There would be long, procedural, paper-heavy months of the kind of work that didn't look like anything from the outside. She was ready for it. She'd always been better at the slow work than the dramatic moments, and that was fine, because the slow work was what held. The ward doors opened, and the sound of it came through. Monitors and footsteps and the particular low-key controlled rhythm of people doing difficult things with competence and care. And she walked into it, and the door swung closed behind her, and the corridor was quiet. The woman who'd been told to know her rank did. She'd known it all along.